I'll be reading Joshua 3, verse 14 through 17 from the New International Version. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage, all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priest who carried the Ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the sea of the Arabah, the Salt Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel passed by until the whole of the nation had completed the crossing on dry ground.
Okay, we're ready to get started here. There's our last lesson in VBS this year, and I want to tell you something. I've really enjoyed that. I don't know all the people involved in all the planning, but I want to begin just by thanking everybody that had a part in this. There's a lot going on. I know for several Sundays there, they had me making announcements about needing more of these poo noodles, and I had no idea what in the world we're going to use them for. And then you look around, they make great trees, don't they? I mean, they just... hours that people put into that. I appreciate that. I appreciate those that work with us in doing the skits every night for the kids, those that are doing the puppets. And I appreciate the fact that Jason asked me to be able to speak tonight, and I'm grateful for all the men we've had speaking here. There have been some great lessons and some things that have been helpful to me and hopefully been helpful to everybody else here. Tonight, what we're looking at, the last of these lessons, the crossing over the Jordan, entering into the promised land as God had told them. It's been a long journey for Israel. It's been 40 years. When they left Egypt, for the first time they were experiencing freedom in their lives. All of their lives, all they had known was slavery. They were born in slavery, they grew up in slavery, and now they're enjoying freedom. But not just freedom. When they left Egypt with great riches. God had told Moses, you tell the people to ask those people in Egypt, you ask them for their gold and silver jewelry and for the clothing. And the Egyptians gladly gave to them. Probably they were glad to get rid of them. You know, after the 10 plagues, all they'd gone through, and especially the last one, the death of the firstborn male, they were probably glad to get rid of the Jews. And so they're allowed to go free, and they go free with riches. But what a journey they've had. But through it all, God's been with them. There was God's GPS that we talked about that first night. And God's GPS being the pillar of fire that led them through the wilderness, to areas they'd never been before. You had God's Red Cross food supply for them, providing food and water. You had God giving to them the rules by which they would be living in this new land. He gave all of that to them. But it wasn't long. They began hitting some bumps in the road. And they began having problems, and because of that, they began to complain about their situations, and their desire was simply to be able to go back into Egypt. They complained against Moses and against their situations there in the land over and over again. And God became so irritated about that, He made the decision that He would destroy all of Israel except for Moses. And He told Moses, I'll make a great nation out of you. That had to have been a temptation, I would think, to Moses. You know, to fill a person with pride and think, of all these, I'm the only one that God is pleased with, and He's willing to kill off all the rest and just start all over again with me. And God made that statement to them. He said, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. God made the decision because of the fact that Moses interceded that He would not destroy them. But God said they'll not see that land that I'd promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. They'll be denied that because of their rebellion against God. 600,000 men of military age had left Egypt. But of those 600,000, only 2 would make it into the promised land. You stop and think about it, that's not very good odds, is it? Just 2 out of 600,000. But those are the only ones who would go into that land. And the reason why is because of the requirement that God made. God's requirement of them is to have faith in God. And it's not just any kind of faith. It's not just a mental assent that they believe in God. It's the kind of faith that will act to be obedient to God in everything that He tells them. But they haven't been willing to do that. They've been in rebellion to God. But if they're going to enter in, they're going to have that kind of faith. And the reason the great majority of them did not make it, those 599,998 didn't make it because of their lack of faith in God and their lack of trust to do what God wanted them to do. In the book of Numbers, chapter 14 and verse 11, we find God speaking again to Moses about the people and their lack of faith. And He says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them?" The word signs that are used there, it's talking about miracles, but that's a special kind of miracle. A miracle is called a sign when it's a miracle that's given to produce faith and confidence in the people so they can know that the one behind them here is God. And they can know that, in this case, Moses, who is God's representative, is speaking forth for God. And so they need to listen to what he says and be obedient to him because of the miracles that God has done for them, both in Egypt and now out in the wilderness. And all of that is given as evidence to them that God is with them. But in spite of all the evidence, they still haven't believed. And God says, He asked this question, how long will they not believe? How long can His people go on continuing that way, seeing all the evidence and not believing? Oh, they believe in God, but they're not trusting God, that God will be able to take care of them and help them. And so for that lack of faith, they're not going to be able to go in. And the two who do go in because they have a great faith in God. In our skit tonight, we talk primarily about Joshua. But I want us to look at this man, Caleb. Caleb was a man of tremendous faith in God, and that's the reason that he was blessed by God and allowed to go into that land. In the book of Numbers, chapter 13, and verse 30, says, "Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, 'Let us go up at once and take it, for we're well able to overcome it.'" When the 10 spies said, "Yes, we are in a full agreement. It is a land of milk and honey." But there's something wrong with that land. It's a land whose cities are well fortified and the people that live there are giants. And there's no way we can overcome it. We're like grasshoppers before them. And so they felt like we couldn't do it. But Caleb has a totally different idea about it. Caleb believes they can do it. Now Caleb has a great faith in God, and he's going to talk about that later. We're going to notice that. But here he's showing also the faith and confidence he has in his brothers and sisters. He is saying here, we are well able to. Let us go up at once. It's not let me do it, but us. He recognized they had to work together, be cooperative, and working together to be able to take that land. They didn't believe they could do it, but Caleb had confidence in them. We need to be that way with one another. Sometimes we have brothers and sisters that have doubts about things and feel like it just can't be done. We've got to have enough confidence in them to let them know, yes, we can. And you can do it. I can't do it alone, but together we can. And have that kind of faith in them. And that's the kind of faith Caleb had in the rest of the Israelites, that they could do this. But it's more than that. He is a man that had great faith in God. Caleb was 40 years old when he went first time into that promised land. And he came back all enthusiastic about it. He was ready to go. 40 years old, that's pretty much in the prime of his life. He's still young, he's still got his strength, and he's eager to serve God, and he's eager to go in and take that land that God has promised to them. But because of the fact that the 10 spies gave an evil report, Israel's not ready to go in. They turn away, and so God will not let them go in. And God takes them away, and He's going to march them through the wilderness for 40 years till all of that generation is dead before He'll allow them to come back to go into that land. So when they come back in, and really it's 45 years later, by the time that Caleb is ready to go in and he's there to speak to the people again. And Caleb is now 85 years old. Now, I can understand when you're 40 you've got that courage, you've got that strength, you're ready to go and to serve God. But when you're 85, it's a little bit different. I'm only 67. And I'm thinking about the things that I used to do that I cannot do anymore. And going out and knocking doors like we would do on Super Saturday and through the week didn't bother me at all. Didn't matter how high the hills were. But now it's a big struggle. I can't imagine what it's like for a man 85 years old. But at 85 years of age, Caleb is still eager to go in and take that land that God has promised to them. But as the commercials say, but wait, there's more to it than that. Listen to what Caleb says to them here. Again, looking at this in the book of Joshua, he talks about it in Joshua 14 and verse 12. Caleb says, "Now therefore, give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke in that day. For you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said." The hill country he's talking about, the city there that would be known later to the Jews as Hebron, and that would be the first capital they would have when they got into the land. But the name Hebron, originally the name of that city was Kiriath Arba, which literally means city of Arba. And then the Bible explains to us that Arba was the king, the leader of the Anakim. Well, who were the Anakim? They were the giants. And so he said, here's the land I want. God had promised me, wherever my footsteps went, that would be mine. But here's the land I want. I want this mountain where the giants are. I want this land where there are the fortified cities. Those places you said we could not take, you were afraid to try it. I'm 85 years old. Give me that land. And look at the confidence he has in God. If, he says, in regard to this, if it may be that God will be with me, I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. If God's with him, he knows he can win. God was with him. And Caleb was successful in overcoming those cities. He drove out those nations, those giants. And he was victorious in taking over that land for himself and for his family. But here's a man that had that great faith and that confidence in God. And the reason he is able to enter that land is because that God required great faith. Many of those Jews had faith, but the faith they had was weak. Some of them's faith may even have been dead. But Caleb had an active, living faith, confident that God would help him, and God did help him, and he was successful in taking that land. So, number one, when they first came to that land, God had required faith. But because of a lack of faith on their part, they weren't able to go in. So now, time has passed by. They've been through the wilderness wanderings, and they come back again. God sends out 2 spies, and they come back. And they're all ready to go in now and take the land. But before they can go into that land, what's God going to require of them? God, you required a great faith of them the first time, and it failed miserably. Only 2 out of 600,000 had that kind of faith. Lord, don't you think maybe we ought to reduce that requirement just a little bit? Shouldn't we make it just a little bit easier for the people? No. God is not going to change. His requirements are still the same. God is still required of them that same faith. So the second time they go in, God is still required of them great faith if they're going to be able to go in and take that land. But before God requires that great faith, He gives them evidence again. Another sign is going to be performed so they can know that God is with them and they can be successful. God has told the people, they gather there to the Jordan River, and He's given the command that the priests are to bear the Ark of the Covenant, and they're to come there to the Jordan River. Now, the Jordan River at this time is at the flood season. It's the time of harvest. But God tells them when the priests bearing that ark, when their feet go into the waters are going to stop flowing, and they'll back up into a heap, back to the city of Adam. It's not like in this picture nearby. Adam was a few miles away. But it's going to back up all the way to there, and the rest of the water will keep flowing down into the salt sea. And people will be able to go across on that land. And they'll be able to enter into that promise. So there's a great miracle that's going to be done by God in doing that. Now, one of the things that's intriguing to me about this, that Moses, when he first led them out of Egypt, what was the first great obstacle they had to overcome? The Red Sea. They had a body of water to overcome too. But on that occasion, God caused that sea to divide. He gave them the command to Moses, and that sea is divided, and they're all able to walk across on dry ground. Now they come to the Jordan River. And the Jordan River is at flood stage, and they're not going to be able to just walk across. But as it was with Moses, so it is here. And God causes that river to stop flowing so the people can go across on dry ground. Now here's a lesson for every one of us. When I thought about this, my first thoughts went back to the story about Elijah and Elisha. You remember Elijah was that great prophet of God, and God's gotten ready to call Elijah away. And so he knows that his days here are numbered, and he's going on to be with God. And so he leaves, going to where God has told him to go, and Elisha trails along with him. And Elijah tried to persuade Elijah, to go back. You can't come with me because God's going to take me up. But Elisha refuses to go. And they come up to the Jordan River. And Elijah takes that mantle off, and he rolls it up, and he takes that mantle, and he smites the Jordan River with it. And what happened? The Bible says that the waters went this way and that way. And Elijah and Elisha walked across on dry ground. And when they get over there, that's when the chariot of fire comes and separates Elisha from Elijah. And Elijah's carried up in that chariot of fire. And Elisha's crying out, and the mantle of Elijah falls to the ground, and Elisha picks it up. Now it's interesting that there were other prophets of the school of prophets who had begged Elisha, let us go search for Elijah. Maybe God has taken him and put him on some mountain over here and we can go get him. And Elisha knows that's not the case. And he tells them no, and they keep on and on, and finally he says go, and they go. But he knows they're not going to find him because Elijah's gone. So Elisha takes now that mantle that belonged to Elijah, and he comes to the Jordan River. Takes that mantle, and he smites the Jordan River with it. And as he did, listen to his words. Elisha says, not where is Elijah? He smites that river and he says, where is the God of Elijah? And when he strikes that river, it divides just like it had done for Elijah, and he walks across on dry ground. Elijah is gone, but the God of Elijah is still there. Now when Israel comes to cross that Jordan River to enter into that promised land, they've got a boundary there. They've got an obstacle to overcome, that river at flood stage, just like they'd had when they came out of Egypt to the Red Sea. But Moses isn't with them anymore. But that doesn't matter. Moses is gone, but the God of Moses is still there. And the power is still there. And God provides for them this miracle. That river is divided so they can pass over on dry ground. Now when they get to the other side, they take up 12 stones and they make a memorial there so that in the days to come when their children ask, what do these stones mean? You can tell them that God dried up this river so that we could walk across and enter this land. But after they do that, question, what's the first thing that God told them to do after they crossed the Jordan River? My son asked me that the other day in conversation. He said, what was the first thing you were asked to do? I said, well, he put up those stones and more. No, after that. What was the first thing that God told them to do? Do you know what he told them? God told Joshua, make you knives of flint and circumcise all the men of Israel a second time. Now the men weren't literally being circumcised a second time. These men that are with them there are men that grew up in the wilderness. And during that time in the wilderness, when their sons were born, they weren't circumcising them they should have. So all of these men have grown up and they haven't been circumcised. But that's the sign of God's covenant with them. And so God commands, you take flints and knife and you circumcise. Wait a minute, God, wait. Do you know what you're asking? Do you know how dangerous that is? We have just now crossed the Jordan, and for the first time we have entered the land of our enemies. And you're asking us to circumcise these men? Think back with me for a moment. Back to Genesis chapter 34. Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, has been raped. The man that raped her, Shechem, wants to marry her. And he's got his father to go and to talk to Jacob, to plead with him that they might give Dinah over to his sons. But two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Eli, Simeon and them are opposed to that. They think, no, how can you do that? Our daughter has been raped by that man, and you want to give her away to them? So they said, we can't do that. Because you men, you're a nation of uncircumcised people, and it's not right for us. But if all of your men will agree to be circumcised, then we'll do it. We'll give our daughters to your sons, and you can give your daughters to our sons, and we'll become one nation together. But you're going to have to be circumcised. So Shechem and his father talked about it, and that sounded reasonable to them, so they went and talked to the men of the city and said, listen, if you'll be circumcised, we'll all do that, then we can have this uniting with them and become as one nation. And so the men agreed to do it, and they were circumcised. Genesis chapter 34, verse 25. Now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. Two men with swords were able to kill every male in the city of Shechem. How could they do that? Well, those men had just been circumcised, and they're in pain. They can't get up and defend themselves. When that happens, you're weakened. You can't fight. Now, Israel has just crossed over into the land of the enemy, and the first thing God tells them to do, you need to be circumcised. God, if we're circumcised, that means for at least 3 days, and maybe more, we would be at the mercy of our enemy. If they come upon us, they could destroy every one of us. We won't be able to defend ourselves. But that's what God told them to do, and so they obeyed. That shows their faith and confidence in God. If God commanded them to do it, they'll do it, and they'll trust that God will take care of them, protect them from their enemies, and no harm will come to them. And so God is trying their faith. Just as He had done initially when they came out of Egypt, the faith of those Israelites was tried, and they failed miserably because they did not respond to do what God wanted them to do. In fact, when their faith was tested, they cried out and said, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader, and returned to Egypt. That generation, because of their lack of faith, died in the wilderness. This new generation, their faith is tested by God, and they are obedient. They have that faith and confidence in God, so they do what He says. They pass that test. They show the faith that they have in God, and that faith is a living and active faith, and because of that, God allows them into that land, and they'll be the ones to conquer it and settle it and to live there with their families. So faith was required the initial time they came to that land, and the second time, that faith is still being required of them in order to enter in. But the last thing that I want us to mention tonight, and I think is of importance, is the fact that we need to be careful, we need to be aware, lest we come short of entering into our promised land. Now, the promised land of Israel there in Palestine, I don't believe that that was a type of heaven, but I believe that it was a shadow of it. There are a lot of similarities between it. And just as they had that land promised to them by God, we have a land promised to us by God. But just as so many of them failed to enter in because of their disobedience, because of their lack of faith, We need to be careful lest we fail to enter into that land that God's promised us because of our lack of faith. And it could happen to any one of us. Think again with me about this man, Moses. Moses was a prophet unlike any other that Israel had ever known. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, the 34th chapter, it talks about Moses. It says, "There has not arisen a prophet like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, and for all the miracles that he did." He not only had that close relationship with God, not only did all those miracles, but he was a great deliverer. He delivered them out of Egyptian bondage. He was a great lawgiver. He gave to them God's law by which they were to live. Moses has spent 40 years of his life trying to get these people out of Egypt and into that land that God had promised them. And when they had been disobedient and God was ready to destroy them, it was Moses that interceded on their behalf to see to it that God did not destroy them. And now they come to that land and they get ready to enter in. Moses is not going to be permitted to enter in. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 2. To me is one of the saddest verses here in the life of Moses in the Bible. Moses has gathered all the people together to himself, and he said to them, "I am 120 years old this day, and I'm no longer able to go out and come in. Also the Lord has said unto me, you shall not go over this Jordan." You think about that. The goal toward which he's been working for 40 years. He's been tried so many times by his own people. And now God's telling him, you can't go in. He can't go in because, as Skip talked about it in his lesson, the fact that he has been disobedient to God. When God told him to speak to the rock, he struck it. But it was more than just that. When he struck the rock, he had cried out to the people, "Must we fetch water for you, you rebels?" And in the book of Psalms, when the psalmist talks about this, Psalms 106, verse 32 and 33, the psalmist says, "They," that is Israel, "angered God at the waters of strife, so that it went ill with Moses on account of them, because they rebelled against his spirit, so that he," that is Moses, "spoke rashly with his lips." It wasn't just striking that rock, it's what Moses said that got him in trouble. He spoke rashly. He spoke without thinking. He put his mouth in motion before he put his mind in gears. And he said to those people, "Must we bring forth water for you?" Excuse me, Moses. You're a great man. No prophet like you in all the land. But Moses, you're just a man. You're not on the level with God. It's not you and God doing this, it's God. And when you spoke like that, you were speaking rashly. And it's because you've done that, you put yourself on the level of God. You can't enter into that land, and so he's not allowed to enter into it. Deuteronomy 34, 1 to 5. Then Moses went up from the plain of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. Moses serves as a warning to each and every one of us. We need to be careful lest something happen to us that we not enter in to that land of promise that God has made to us. The Hebrew writer said in Hebrews 3 and verse 12, "Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God." I believe with all my heart, in fact, I'm confident enough I can say that Moses is going to be in heaven. He's going to enjoy that promised land that we're looking for. But I'm just simply using him as an example as someone who lost that promised land made to Israel because of disobedience. And the Bible warns us if we're not careful because of that heart of unbelief, we might lose the right to enter into that land of promise that God has for us. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 1 says, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering His rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it." So again, there's a warning. There's a possibility that we might come short of that land. Hebrews 4 and verse 11, "Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience." If we're not faithful to God, to live for God as we should, we won't be able to enter in. God wants us to enter in. God's promised that land. But whether or not we enter into it is dependent upon whether or not we're obedient to the will of God. That means in becoming His child, because of our faith in Christ, we repent of sins, confess Jesus, and we're buried with Christ in baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And as God's child who's gone astray, we simply have to repent of those sins and pray to God for the forgiveness we need, and God will forgive. And we want to give that invitation here tonight as we close out this VBS. If there's anyone here that needs to respond in obedience to the will of God, then we want you to encourage you to do that. Do we have a song for us? As we stand and sing this song now, we encourage you. If you need to respond, please come forward at this time.